Yeah, so I just want to point out, like, the first thing that we think of is often her clothes. So the way she dresses herself. So the way I would dress myself, I wouldn't be considered by most people an ideal Muslimah, not a perfect Muslimah, an ideal Muslimah, because regardless of
Asian perspective lah.
perspective within our context lah, within our community. So regardless of sebab nak tudung di atas, nampak chest kan.
Jangan marah ya.
Tak. This is the discussion that I want to bring up lah.
Macam saya lah, suara ya.
We immediately think of the tudung, and even when we think of the tudung, it has to be in a certain way. So this is often not considered the proper way of wearing the hijab, because the proper way of wearing the hijab, I have to cover my body, make sure that the shape of my body is not shown, it's covering my chest, and so it doesn't really matter for a lot of people if this person is actually practicing the other aspects of required of a Muslim. If she prays 5 times a day, if she reads the Quran, if she fasts, if she avoids if she avoids sins like drinking, engaging in casual sex. So it doesn't really matter all of these things. The first thing that we often think of is her clothes. And I think that this is quite problematic, because we would equate a woman's religiosity to this piece of cloth, to a dress code. And so we're distilling the Muslim female identity to just this dress code, right? As though that it was somehow a measure of your personal relationship to God. Which brings me to my second question. If I ask you to define, according to what society thinks of as the proper hijab, what constitutes this proper hijab? But the thing is, for me, is this idea of covering ourselves because our bodies are inherently alluring. So I think that idea, it objectifies women in a way that we reduce women to objects of visual consumption. So the idea that when women exist standing right here, we are simply seen first of all as sexual objects, or sexual beings, and therefore we require, before we can interact with her, before we can allow ourselves to see if we can respect her as a human being, she has to cover herself first. And I think that this idea that to prevent the sexual objectification of women, we must cover her, is very, it's how do you say, what's the word?
Degrading.
Not degrading. It's
relegating women to another state.
Yeah, because the idea itself, when you say that to prevent women from being sexually objectified, they have to cover themselves, is sexual objectification in itself. Because the justification behind that is the assumption that women are objects of visual consumption or visual pleasure for men. So the dilemma for me that still exists for me is that if we can say that we cover for God, and for me personally, I do cover for God, but if we took out the male gaze, if we decenter the male gaze, we find ourselves ultimately trying to fit into standards that are determined by men. What men find sexually alluring, not what God finds sexually alluring. It's not really stated, what is sexualized in women, what is inherently sexualized in women. So we've internalized the male gaze. We've internalized this idea that men are constantly watching us, and therefore we have to cover ourselves. So in this sense, are we really actually covering for God when we are following standards that have been set by men? I think it's men hold the majority of power in society, and that power is not achieved unless it is built on the subjugation of women. So I think the fear that if we give women choice to empower themselves, then they would be using that power to disempower men the way men have gained power by disempowering women.
Yeah.
Anyway, going back to your story, I think it's a perfect example of how we see you as a human being, the contributions that you've made as second, and the first thing that we see you is this you trying to conform to this ideal, the archetype of the ideal Muslimah. So as long as you do not conform to this ideal, everything else is just it's invalidated, it's delegitimized. It doesn't matter if you are
top scorer.
Yeah, if you're a top scorer. It doesn't matter if you are a high-ranking politician. As long as you don't wear the hijab, someone will always find a way to invalidate everything that you've done to society. And I think it's something quite personal for me as well, because I don't consider myself to be a scholar of the Quran, but a lot of my work requires me to study the Quran and the legal constructs extracted from the Quran and how that applies in everyday life. So when people see me, they don't see me as someone who is in a position to speak on anything about the Quran or to speak on anything about religion, simply because they don't see me as the ideal Muslimah, because I'm dressed a certain way, because I'm outspoken, because of all of these things. So there's that double standard in that you don't really treat men the same. I mean, if you see a guy in, do we have a concept of the ideal Muslim?
Yeah, probably do.
Yeah, the Prophet of God, yeah. But I mean, like, in the same way as we have the concept of the ideal Muslimah, like, do we police the way men dress?
Well, I don't think
That
you would
was
call.
the ideal Muslimah.
Well, I don't think you would call a man who wears shorts and goes clubbing every night an ideal Muslim.
Yeah.
So there are standards there as well. Of course,
But
the standards
yeah.
of women are heavier.
Yeah, exactly. That's the crux of this issue. The fact that these standards are placed so heavily on women that is institutionalized in some places. Yeah, so like we don't have laws regulating the way women dress, the way men dress. Whereas you do have laws that regulate the way women dress in certain places, in certain societies. And even though there are no laws, it's so inscribed within society that we police and shame women when they do not conform to these standards of these dress codes that do not exist as much for men, or they do exist, but we do not police and shame men as much.
Yeah.
Yes, I understand that for some people, probably for a lot of people, when women want to express their faith, they want to express it through their clothes. And that plays into why I personally also wear the hijab. Because for me, this is my way of showing my relationship, of physically embodying my relationship to God. But I don't think that and this is the current situation right now that I see within society, and that through conversations with a lot of women that they experience as well, I don't think that this idea that a believing woman should wear the hijab should enable all of us to say that because a woman does not wear the hijab, it makes her less of a believer. And that is a problem, and that is the crux of the issue that I'm bringing up right now. That we should always give women the choice how they want to express their faith.